Several months ago, Tina Ngata published an article entitled "Make No Mistake, There is No Indigenous Support for Israel." It was essentially a hit piece on those Māori who support Israel, including me. At the time, I decided Ngata's accusations, including the libelous claim that our organisation is affiliated with the far right and white supremacists, were so ludicrous they should not be dignified with a response. But evidently, Ngata's academically weak and spurious content is being spread via workshops and on university campuses. So, somewhat reluctantly, for the sake of those ingesting this poison, I offer this response. At first reading, Ngata's statement, "Make no mistake, there is no Indigenous support for Israel," appears to be simple ignorance. Of course, there's Indigenous support for Israel historically and currently within Aotearoa, New Zealand and around the world. However, it soon becomes clear that Tina Ngata's strategy is to undermine the Indigenous status of those people with whom she disagrees. Ngata is a political activist who holds to settler colonial ideology. This ideology has a narrow worldview that judges a Māori person or group by a particular set of criteria. Māori who do not conform to this radical agenda are labelled colonial Māori. Patrick Wolfe, one of its chief proponents, called settler colonialism, quote, "a structure, not a single event." The goal of settler colonialism is not simply to address past wrongs, and indeed there were grievous wrongs inflicted upon Māori as the government supported land-hungry settlers to divest Māori of land, whether through warfare or legislation. However, settler colonialism sets out not simply to purge society of that, quote, original sin of dispossession of Indigenous peoples, but to destroy the society that was built thereafter. It demands hatred of what it calls Western values and has in its sights the dismantling of the entire system that colonialism is purported to have built. Every non-Indigenous person is implicated as part of that structure. This totalising system is an all-encompassing dogma with doctrines of sin, guilt, punishment, rewards, and apostasy, but importantly, no redemption. For example, Ngata has produced a tangata tiriti checklist, a post-colonial 10 Commandments, which devotees can use to strive for purity. The document contains an explicit set of do's, don'ts, and affirmations, including, quote, "I acknowledge that the Crown government is a treaty violation," end quote. By this criteria, thousands of Māori would fail to make the grade, including my Māori mum, kuia, koro, many of my tupuna. Those tupuna who fought with the Crown would likely be labelled colonial Māori, while my other ancestors who fought against the Crown and were punished with the loss of lands would probably pass muster. There's a very long list of Māori leaders who would be rejected by Ngata, including the late Ngāpuhi Kaumātua, Patrick Luka, who organised several hui for Israeli ambassadors. These included a whakapaha ceremony to apologise for New Zealand's 2016 sponsorship of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2334, and to welcome back the ambassador following his recall. The Māori Queen, Te Ariki Nui, Dame Te Atairangi Kahu, had great affection for Israel and hosted Israeli ambassadors. Highly respected leader Monty Ohia was a force within Māoridom as an educator. He was standing as a candidate for the Māori Party at the time of his death in 2008. He was also the instigator and leader of the World Christian Gathering of Indigenous People, which began in 1996 at Tamatakapua Meeting House in Rotorua, to which I whakapapa. Ohia recognised Jews as Indigenous people and supported their inclusion in the movement. These respected leaders would certainly not pass Ngata's purity laws. Ngata talks a lot about the doctrine of discovery, which came from a 1493 papal bull issued by Pope Alexander VI. It stated that any territories outside of Europe that were not inhabited by Christians were open to claims of discovery and implicitly some form of sovereignty by whichever Catholic power reached these territories first. However, historians have pointed out that the doctrine of discovery did not apply to New Zealand at all. This is just one example of the way that settler colonial ideology fails to deal with historical realities, nuance, and detail. It's politically driven, totalizing worldview with a divisive and destructive agenda. According to Ngata, Christianity is implicated as a tool of colonization to subjugate Indigenous peoples. This view allows no room for historical agency, the choices made, and the various factors influencing those choices. It certainly does not honour the will of our tupuna, many of whom chose Christianity as a better way. Rather, it infantilises our forebears. There are many examples of Māori who embraced Christianity. In fact, the coming of Christianity was prophesied in the 1700s by Toi Roa of Ngāti Rangi, who predicted the arrival of Europeans in Christianity with the saying, Te ingoa o tō rātou atua, ko tama I roro kutia he atua pai, o te rā kamate. Translated as, the name of their God will be Tama I roro kutia. He is a good God, but he will be killed. This prophecy was understood by many as a reference to Jesus Christ. Tama I roro kutia can be interpreted as the son who was ill-treated or the son who was killed. Ngā Puhi leader Ruatara in 1814 welcomed the missionaries. Perepi Taumata Akura was one of the earliest Māori evangelists who learned Christianity from the missionaries in the Bay of Islands, returned to the east coast to teach his people long before the European missionaries arrived in the region. In fact, Māori were the greatest evangelists of other Māori, sharing the message amongst our people with great zeal. They were not merely passive recipients of European Christianity, but active participants in its development. Wiremu Tamihana, known as the Kingmaker, and in fact the Kiangitanga movement was deeply influenced by Christianity. Tahu Pōtiki Wiremu Rātana became known as a healer and founded a religion based on Christian ideas. He was also an Indigenous activist who attempted to take the case of the Treaty of Waitangi breaches to King George in London and to the League of Nations in Geneva. He later formed the Rātana political party. He is said to have held the treaty in one hand and the Bible in the other. Ngata's reference to Euro-Christianity fails to understand that while the message came via European people, it was the Bible itself and its story that impacted our people. The original languages of the book, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, affirm its origin in or near the land of Israel. It tells a Middle Eastern story, not a European one. The writers of the book, the prophets, apostles, the one recognised as the Messiah, were all Jewish. As a Māori friend states, the Bible changed us. To deny this fact dishonours our tupuna by despising the choices they made. Many Māori identified particularly with the Israelite history of the Old Testament, leading to the development of several Māori prophetic movements, including Ringatu, Iharaira Faith, and Paimarere. Ngata claims that Indigenous people recognise each other in the forums that matter, at Indigenous conferences and hui. Does she recognise the Rātana, Ringatu, Iharaira faiths and the many thousands of evangelical and Pentecostal Māori who turn up to hui and meetings up and down the country? Or does she dismiss all these and deny them their whakapapa, their heritage, because they don't fit her narrow, politicised worldview? Unsurprisingly, many Māori Christians support Israel. In 2024, our Indigenous Coalition for Israel led the establishment of an Indigenous embassy in Jerusalem as a platform for expression of Indigenous solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people. The IEJ is non-sectarian and offers representation of all Indigenous people who support Israel, regardless of their belief system. We soon discovered that such an embassy had been a desire of Indigenous peoples for decades, and that in 1999, 100 Native American chiefs and leaders went to Israel's Knesset and expressed their desire for an embassy. The aforementioned Monte Ohia played a significant role encouraging Indigenous peoples to worship in their uniquely Indigenous ways, for Māori with haka, poi, Te Reo Māori and for First Nations of Turtle Island by taking up their drums again and wearing their traditional regalia. Ohia had a massive impact on the Indigenous peoples of that network. This was an example of decolonisation without the totalising, harmful ideology of settler colonialism. It allowed for change and the embrace of new ideas while affirming the historical identity of Indigenous peoples. As I've said, settler colonialism is a political construct which fails to deal with the reality of complex histories which do not fit within its binary modalities. What does that mean? This is the practice of dividing all people into two groups, the powerful and the powerless, the oppressor and the oppressed. This theory casts all settlers as oppressors and all Māori as victims. In reality, there are usually oppressors and victims on both sides. That's simply humanity. Ngata's blanket statement, quote, Western colonialism is the source of all Indigenous oppression around the world, end quote, allows no room for agency, that is, the ability to choose, and implies there was no oppression prior to colonisation. History tells us otherwise. Te Ao Māori was certainly no utopia prior to colonisation, and we have some shocking stories in our own iwi histories. Settler colonialism fails to take into account the numerous factors that contribute to oppression. It's simply intellectually lazy to blame colonisation for all the ills experienced today. In the 19th century, many Māori chose to engage with the Westminster parliamentary system. In 1867, Māori seats were created, one of the longest-standing examples of Indigenous representation in a modern national parliament. Settler colonialism's blanket generalisations fail to deal with lived reality, the psychological forces at play, and the ways in which cultures change and develop. Such an ideology must keep Indigenous peoples trapped in a mentality of grievance and victimism. Otherwise, the system collapses. The system lumps factors such as modernity and urbanisation under the one rubric of colonisation. It fails to acknowledge the benefits of these developments and the ways in which many Māori have embraced and exploited modernity and achieved great success internationally in multiple fields in the arts, business, sport, music, all the while affirming their Indigenous identity. Ngata rejects the colonial economy, leaving no place for Māori business leaders in the thriving Māori economy. Another stream of the political lineage Ngata espouses has a dominant Marxist foundation. It looks to the likes of Cuban leader Fidel Castro and PLO leader Yasser Arafat, two men responsible for the murder of thousands. Donna Awatere, in her 1984 book, Māori Sovereignty, developed a platform for Māori sovereignty modelled on the ideas of the terrorist group, the Palestinian Liberation Front. The founding document of the PLP designated Israel, Zionism, world imperialism, and Arab reaction as the enemy. Awatere took this idea, but instead identified the enemy as Pākehā, New Zealand, Christianity, Britain, and colonial Māori. These were the forces Awatere saw as obstructions to the possibility of establishing New Zealand as a Māori nation-state. Ngata builds on this activist heritage, which sees Western civilization as the source of all evil. Ironically, it is that same Western culture of freedom and open inquiry that enables academics like Awatere and Ngata to develop and disseminate their views. In seeking to undermine the West, they threaten the very liberties they enjoy. Te Pāti Māori also declares itself an activist party and claims that Māori did not cede sovereignty. Using the privilege, power and wealth afforded by their position as tax-paid servants of the state, Te Pāti Māori leaders are pushing for the overthrow of the system in which they operate and the establishment of a separate Māori parliament. Settler colonialism demands hatred of Western values and the many structures of Western society, including politics, education, media, and church, that these must be dismantled. However, it's seldom made clear what would arise from the ash heap as a replacement. Herein lie the seeds of its downfall. The decolonisation movements of the 20th century often led to bloody conflict. This ideologically driven pursuit of an idealised future frequently leads to totalitarianism and destruction. Not only does the decolonisation narrative leave no room for those Indigenous peoples who hold a different perspective, it is brutal for non-Indigenous who do not toe the line. Ironically, most Māori, like me, have Pākehā whakapapa, and yet we are expected to dishonour our Pākehā ancestors by adopting this hateful perspective. Non-Māori are held guilty for the crimes of a subset in the past. There's no room for Pākehā, who'd been sold the lie propagated by the New Zealand Company of a paradise on the other side of the world where opportunity and wealth awaited them, who instead found themselves in a rugged land living in makeshift shanties with limited access to the outside world and little chance of return to life and family back home. Meanwhile, the New Zealand Company railed against all those who stood in the way of their goals. The British Colonial Office, successive governors of New Zealand, the Church Missionary Society, and the missionary Reverend Henry Williams. It also vehemently and stridently opposed the Treaty of Waitangi. There are many flaws in settler colonialism. It's an extremely judgmental and divisive view of the world, seeks the overthrow of the current system, and bears the seeds of violence and ultimately its own destruction. While the democratic system that has dominated the Western world for the past 200 to 300 years has many flaws, it remains one of the most stable systems of government. Is there racism in this country? Yes. Are there structural failures? Yes. However, settler colonialism offers no solution. It promotes hatred of the other, resentment and bitterness. We would do well instead to cultivate concepts of grace, mercy, forgiveness, restitution, reconciliation and respect. The totalising lens of settler colonialism should be rejected. It keeps Māori locked in a grievance culture, provides no vision of a future where Māori flourish as Māori, in relative harmony with non-Indigenous New Zealanders. There is no denying the wrongs of the past or the difficulties of the present, but there is a better way than the myopic bitterness of settler colonialism. By embracing the values of respect and honouring all peoples, we can forge a better path.